happy to be talking today, especially as we have such a provocative topic for the forum this year. The digital perfect storm. I really like that in that it contains really two sides of the coin we're looking at moving forward. First off, that perfect aspect of it makes it sound like something very exciting and a huge opportunity, and I think that is true. But there is still also the emphasis on the storm part of it, which is there are some fairly significant challenges we will face moving forward that we need to deal with as companies. So first off, let's start talking about this from the perspective of what I see as the opportunity, the perfection part of the title. First off, I think it's very significant to realize that there's this new buzzword that you can't open up a paper without hearing about: digitalization. But well beyond the buzzword, this really represents a fundamental transformation across multiple industries where smart systems and connectivity are driving entirely new ways of presenting value, engaging with customers, and managing corporations. So whether you're talking about something like in the medical area, where remote medicine is becoming an increasingly important part of managing care, automotive and transportation, where we'll talk about later, where we're really looking at reimagining how transportation works overall. And multiple industries where this ability to make the system smart, collect intelligence, enables us to optimize the experience, the profitability, and the value in ways never done before. Now, these trends have been going on for some time, but the pandemic has radically accelerated these trends. So if you look some of the statistics that are flowing around out there, 63% of companies increased their deployment of cloud technologies in reaction to the pandemic. 56% of companies report they have permanently reduced their travel policies moving forward because of the way they've experienced an ability to still engage, service with their customers, have their people collaborate without having to get on airplanes. 55% are looking at having a new relationship with the office for their employees, where whether it be all remote work or a hybrid type of approach, where people will be able to spend significant amount of time not commuting back and forth to an office. Certainly, Siemens AG announced very early in the pandemic, hybrid will be a permanent part of how we move forward. Talking about medical again, 73% of physicians have talked about how they wish to continue this aspect of doing remote work with their patients moving forward. And underlying that all was the collaboration technology that we seem to all ubiquitously deploy in the matter of weeks at the beginning of the pandemic, where we've seen a 4,000% increase in the usage of these tools in less than a year period of time, as you can see on this chart here. Now, with digitalization comes the first signs of that opportunity for semiconductor, because as I've mentioned a number of times, it's smart systems. Those smarts come from semiconductors, and we can see this driving a significant increase in the amount of value captured for an electronic systems by the underlying semiconductors. You see here a chart that describes that moving from being approximately 16% to 24% over a number of years. That represents an increase of 50% in the value of the semiconductors themselves. That's a significant opportunity for those of us in this forum. Now, driving all this are what I see as four co-joined trends that are operating in a virtuous circle, reinforcing each other to drive this explosion in new applications and new opportunity. Cloud and the data center, as we've seen very clearly in the pandemic, allows us to almost frictionlessly deploy and scale applications in reaction to new trends quickly, effectively, and in a cost-effective manner. Secondly, 5G will rapidly emerge in giving us much wider pipes to be bringing data around these applications that are flowing not just inside the data center, but coming from edge computing, where we are increasingly moving the intelligence of systems closer to sensors, whether they be on the factory floor, a car, a white good in the home, computing data there and pulling that data up through 5G systems into the cloud. And the fourth of these would be AI. AI is becoming a pervasive new technology that allows us to, on a far more effective computation per watt basis, manage and derive the intelligence from that data that we're pulling through these large-scale systems applications. Now, cloud was a well-known trend, as I mentioned before. It was occurring for years. But again, over the last couple of years, what you've seen is both through the baseline trend and the acceleration through the pandemic is that people are now inside of companies looking to deploy cloud approximately twice as fast as was occurring beforehand. 5G, most of the people in this audience are going to be very familiar with this chart, talking about the increase in capability that's available by 5G. And certainly in the baseline market of mobility, you're seeing a rapid adoption of these tools, both for base stations and for the handsets themselves, which drives a well understood increase in the mobility semiconductor market. But beyond mobility, I think it's important to also take a look a little bit at some of the underlying things that occur, for example, in IoT, where these systems that get more pervasive across many more industries. What we're looking at is, in a 3-year period of time, a quadrupling in the amount of semiconductors applied towards that IoT space. Whether it be things in automotive, industrial, or consumer, or the infrastructure itself, this is now becoming a far more significant market for semiconductors. Certainly, this opportunity has not gone unnoticed in the VC community. We had a couple of fairly significant shocks in the past that drove down the level of investment. The dot-com crash in 2001, the financial crash in 2008, and the funding that had gone into the semiconductor industry had gotten very small, and very unencouraging tropes start to become far more pervasive during that time. You heard a lot about how there were so few markets where the cost to develop a chip would sufficiently reward that investment. You heard about how scaling was no longer providing advantages moving forward. Well, certainly those things have started to drop off in terms of the conversation, and you can see the explosion in terms of new investment that's occurring as VCs look and see this same opportunity we just talked about. If you take a look under the hood, there's a couple of things that I think are worth noting. First off is that indeed, as you would expect, AI is providing the majority of this increase in funding over time. This ability to enter brand new markets, apply new technology, is bringing out new investment that's commensurate with the opportunity that is being seen. But it's not just AI. If you take a look at the bars on top, which represent funding in non-AI types of chips, you can solve this is also standing on its own would have been a significant increase over the last few years. So the VC community is certainly seeing this opportunity moving forward and deploying capital to meet that opportunity. It's also important to note that if we take a look under the hood from a regional basis, certainly one of the things you can see here is the effect of China attempting to domesticate semiconductor supply into their electronics business. Again, just like AI was a large portion of the increase, China is a similarly large portion of that increase in terms of the funding over the last few years. But again, it is not just China. If we take a look at the investment that's occurring in the US and the rest of the world, we are again seeing a significant increase in those areas as well. So overall, again, a very optimistic view moving forward from this particular part of the capital markets. I think it's worthwhile taking a short look at one of these markets in terms of what this looks like. Now, automotive has been dominated over the last few years in conversations about autonomy. But I think it's just as important to look at some of the other aspects where, whether it be autonomy, whether it be electrification, or whether it be how those may tie together in terms of a complete reimagining where automotive moves from being where each of the individuals purchases a vehicle and manages their transportation needs out of their garage to where we could be looking at transportation moving to an as-a-service model where you manage your transportation needs from an app. Certainly, we've had some setbacks in terms of the original very optimistic views in terms of when autonomy would provide vehicles, but I think it's still clear that that is the trend line moving forward, is really re-looking at this as a way of moving people around the planet. Now, one of the things that is occurring is that automotive continues to be a growth area for semiconductors, whether it be over the last 10 years, where we look at over a 60% growth in the number of units per vehicle in terms of individual semiconductors, or the value of those semiconductors in a median car having grown by 65% in that same 10-year period. As we look forward, unit growth will be down a little bit. I think it's a well-known trend looking now at re-architecting the electronics within the car for more commonality of control, but that will still be a 28% growth in terms of the number of individual semiconductor components on the car. But because of the value, the growth in dollars per car will continue to grow very strongly by over 50%, up to where we're over $750 per car by the time we hit 2030. Now, we talk all the time about autonomy, which would fall into the safety category here, and certainly this is an area where we are projecting significant growth, but it's not just in the safety systems. If you look here in terms of powertrain, for example, I think in many ways based upon that electrification of the vehicle and how electrification requires significant level of control technology to manage battery life, manage power presentation, all the other aspects of doing electric vehicles will have a growth rate that's high in that market, as well as body, for example, currently forecasting a 12% CAGR over the next few years. So again, it is a ubiquitous opportunity around automotive, driving multiple facets of the manufacturing and design of those. Now, when you start combining all of this together, here's where it starts to get a little bit exciting. We've seen our first forecast coming from IBS where they talk about $1 trillion market by 2030 for semiconductors, which is a significant growth rate moving forward, and a number that rolls off the tongue with quite a bit of glee, to be frank. But I think what's interesting to look at is how this kind of fits into the story of how the semiconductor market has evolved over time. For almost all the early years of our history, semiconductor has always been subject to boom and bust. But it is also, during that same period of time, always grown significantly faster than the overall GDP. And I think this was easy to understand. It's based upon moving from originally in military applications and computers. Semiconductors moved ubiquitously to pervade multiple devices and become far more ubiquitous in people's lives, and that drove us growing faster than overall GDP. Well, things changed in the 2000s and 2010. The 2000s, much of that was driven off the dot-com boom, which took a lot of the air out of the sails for technology in general. And you can see there, during the 2000s, semiconductor grew significantly slower than overall GDP. Similarly, in the 2010 timeframe, we essentially moved to an era where we were growing with the overall world economy. And I think that flattening of growth had a lot to do with some of the things that started to get talked about all the time then. I mentioned it before. Skepticism about scaling, skepticism in our market, talking about consolidation as being one of the primary drivers of growth. But as we look forward over the next 10 years, and I think these trends will last significantly longer than that, what we see is, again, semiconductor being projected to be faster than overall GDP growth. I think this is all based upon that whole aspect of really moving forward. Digitalization, these connected systems will mean semiconductors have a similar move, not just pervasively horizontally across multiple industries, but vertically taking over and doing more of the value presentation within each one of those industries. So obviously from what we've just gone through, I tend to look forward over the next 10 years with an awful lot of optimism. But let's talk a little bit now about perhaps some of the clouds that may be part of this perfect digital storm. All of this really centers for me around supply chain. First off is the chip shortages are one of the most well-reported aspects of our industry in decades. It is very interesting to me right now that more people know about and are aware of semiconductors than at any time in history. Unfortunately, it's all around things like Ford having their trucks sitting in yards waiting for chips to show up, and an inability for someone to pick up a laptop when they hire onto a new company. Now, the one thing I will say is that some of this has been a little bit of self-inflicted wounds. There were many companies that significantly cut their forecasts and order profiles out to semiconductor companies at the beginning of the pandemic under the presumption that their demand was going to collapse. When it quickly recovered, it was very difficult for then those slots in the wafer fab to be brought back to that particular company. And it's hard to imagine there's not a level of double ordering happening right now as companies attempt to protect each other. But it is inarguable that companies are not being able to ship their end products right now because of the semiconductors in there. And again, this is good news and bad news. Bad news is it's a painful situation right now, incredibly difficult conversations happening between customers and CEOs of semiconductor companies. But again, it does emphasize the importance of the semiconductor industry to the overall global market. Now, the other half of this is trade tensions. This ranges from targeting of individual companies, putting in place of tariffs, to what I find to be odd conversations talking about the return of bifurcation, hearkening back to the Cold War era bifurcation between the USSR bloc and the West, when fundamentally there was no trade between those. They did not use technology in common. And you're seeing national governments increasingly talking about semiconductors from a nationalistic perspective. Now, I think it helps to take a look a little bit about what is the scale of this problem and what it would take to bifurcate before we start going down on that path. And one example of that would be the quote on the right. The U.S. is currently looking at potentially deploying $50 billion to attempt to increase the amount of domestic semiconductor production. That's a huge amount of money, causes huge discussions in terms of the political environment. Yet when compared to the deployments of capital that are being envisioned by both TSMC, Korea, it's relatively small. These are huge amounts of dollars we're talking about to put in place foundries at modern technology nodes. It's also interesting to look at it on the side of from China. China for years has been investing very heavily to attempt to domesticate their semiconductor production. And they are achieving success in terms of driving a higher growth rate and a higher projected growth rate for domestic suppliers than for foreign suppliers for consumption and systems manufactured in China. But what's interesting is even with the deployment of capital and investment that's occurring, if you take a look from 2021 to 2030, the incremental market that is expected to come into play then is still being split about 50-50 between domestic growth and foreign growth. And in 2030, we're still expecting that the foreign companies will be a majority of the market, though a smaller one than they were before. So even in the face of all that capital deployed, you're still looking at a co-joined technology supply chain here. I think it's also important to realize that it's not just semiconductor. All semiconductors have to go into an electronic system. And here we have another example where, for example, looking at overall electronic systems production, right now China has approximately a 48% share of that manufacturing. And if we look at, for example, some more complex systems like networking equipment or smartphones, that share is more in the 90% range. Could these change? Of course. Will they change quickly? Of course not. The other thing that I think is worth looking at is what we're talking about in terms of investment in advanced node semiconductor production. We're certainly still seeing some investment in mature nodes. Certainly one of the bigger debates that is occurring in Europe right now is where would European governments be best served to invest? Is it indeed trying to compete on the advanced node front? Or, as suggested by some of your semiconductor companies, would that investment be better spent on established nodes? But if we take a look at the advanced nodes, what you can see here is the capital being deployed through 2021. And indeed, China is spending very heavily to try to domesticate not just the design, but also the manufacturing of semiconductors in their country. But that amount is being spent is still dominated by the spending that is occurring in Taiwan, Korea, and the United States. So again, could each of these regions concentrate in such a way that they could serve only their own needs? Yes. Is that an easy thing to do? No. So perfect digital storm. So which side are you emphasizing? Is it the perfect part or the storm part? You know, we're normally taught to end the presentation with a call to action. In this case, I'd like to end this presentation with a call to question. And it's for you to question yourselves. Is that if you believe the opportunity that we've been talking about, then I ask you whether this chart brings you comfort. This shows the percentage of revenue spent on R&D within semiconductor companies. And what you can see is over the last 20 years, we're moving in a relatively narrow band, perhaps having had some level of increase of maybe 1% or so over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think you have to ask yourself is, in the face of the opportunity, in the face of the radical disruption in so many of the end markets for semiconductors, which requires new thinking, new innovation, new types of technology, is this the right level of spending to face forward that opportunity? So thank you for your time today. I appreciate the attention and truly look forward to the next time perhaps we do this, we can be in a live audience together and be able to speak, meet, and you can actually answer that question. Tell me what your thoughts are. So thank you very much.